Hello, you multi misguided Macallan millionaires. Oh, controversial. But we're only just beginning. But thank you to Dr. Papa 26 for the malt mention. I'm Ralphie. This is the Bothy, home of comprehensive whisky reviews, appreciation of quality spirits, and occasional controversial content. So are you sitting comfortably for the controversial content? I knew you would be. Drams at the ready. Make sure you've got your comfy slippers on, because this is going to be quite informative. Before I start with what I'm about to say, I want to make it absolutely clear, and I know it's in the description box underneath because I always do that, but what I am saying here is only a personal opinion and perspective and should be treated as such. The information I am given is based exclusively on what is available to me and what has been given to me. And therefore, I can provide a certain perspective on the situation, but I can't give completely the full picture. And when you are listening to this content, please keep that in mind. This is a personal opinion, and I'm saying this for the second time now for legal reasons. Right. So, when I started my channel 12 years ago, 2009, I just bought a bottle of Canadian whiskey. These obscure whiskies from little distilleries outside of Scotland, outside of Europe, were only really just becoming available through large retailers based in London who were responding to international demand and therefore sourcing internationally. And one of the bottles was called Glenbretton Canadian Whiskey. And I bought a bottle out of curiosity, and frankly, I really enjoyed it. It was from Glenora Distillery in Nova Scotia, just 60 odd miles south of Inverness, Nova Scotia. And I enjoyed the whiskey, although it was a bit young and a little bit raw and had a little bit of inexperience about it. It was refreshing to me because I'd never tasted a whiskey like it before. It was different. And it was around about this time that I started to become aware of the court case involving the Scotch Whisky Association, who were, in the interests of protecting the designation and identity of Scotch whisky on the international market, were taking this little distillery to court for using words and phrases which were too Scottish, despite the fact that Glenora Distillery in Nova Scotia here, mind, had it absolutely clear in its label that it was a Canadian whisky. It even had a red maple leaf, which of course comes directly from the Canadian flag. So it's not just saying it in words, it's showing it in pictures. And I objected at the time to the Scotch whisky's intimidation, as I viewed it, of this little distillery for a very simple reason. A business does not have a legal copyright over an authentic and original geographical culture. A culture belongs to the culture and to the people and can be borrowed by businesses, by industry, on behalf of that culture for both's benefits, but it doesn't become the exclusive property of the business. For example, you have a designation in France for a sparkling wine called champagne. And that's fair enough. If someone wants to produce champagne anywhere else outside of France, they can't call it champagne. However, if you had, say, a distillery in Martinique, which used to be a French colony and has a lot of French culture attached to it. If someone in a rum distillery decided that they wanted to have a champagne-inspired rum, frankly, I wouldn't have a problem with that, because it's the culture that comes first, not the copyright. Anyway, many years later, another distillery opens up. Just to conclude, by the way, in the Glenora situation, the Canadian distillery won their case. The Scotch Whisky Association lost the case. And Glenora Distillery retained its name and identity. And that, by the way, is what you call a legal precedent in a court of law. It means that any legal decisions historically become pertinent in making legal decisions today. And today, legal decisions are possibly going to be getting made, because in Victoria, in Vancouver Island, on the west coast of Canada, another little distillery has started up, relatively small, and it's called McAloney's Caledonian Distillery and Twa Dogs Brewery. Although they say Twa Dogs, not Dugs. And they're producing some really good stuff. In fact, if you come across it, if you can actually find a bottle, I recommend you buy it, because let me tell you, this McAloney's Distillery are winning at a fairly young age some serious awards out there, including the world's best new make spirit. Now, you don't get that out of a lucky bag. You got to earn that. So here you have a small distillery who are producing some very good, authentic, original quality spirit and beer, and starting to get noticed in Canada, are starting to demonstrate to Canadian society that you really can have world-class single malt whiskies if you have the skills and the motivation. Then, despite getting up and running and not getting any too much fuss being made, latterly, and perhaps it's to do with the visibility and recognition of McAloney's Distillery, the Scotch Whisky Association contacted them with a lawyer's letter asking them to remove the references that are applicable and identifiable as Scottish, including the name McAloney's and including the name Caledonian. So I'll focus on these two things, because McAloney is the surname of the proprietor of the distillery. It's his heritage name. And unless there is proper, legal, grounded reason for him not to use his name under local laws, then to challenge him on it could constitute cultural harassment and even possibly racism. Secondly, Caledonian. Yeah, people could get confused with the word Caledonian, thinking it's Scottish, but to be honest, if I was starting a distillery in Canada, I would call it Big Red Leaf. I would not want my Canadian distillery to be confused with Scotch whisky. Do you want to know why? Because I think Scotch whisky generally is starting to lose its reputation. I do. Controversial? Yes. There are still many distilleries in Scotland making some very good whisky. We know who they are. But there's also other distilleries and distillery owners who are increasingly bottling mediocre whisky, increasingly high prices, and it's just putting people off buying Scotch whisky, because as people are saying, it's not as good as it used to be. And I wouldn't describe these people as wrong. Nowadays, people have more options. They can explore further. It's not just about Scotch whisky. There's plenty of bourbons and rums and ryes and cognacs and mezcals. And in fact, one conversation I noticed going on in the background is how many Scotch whisky drinkers are increasingly enjoying independent bottlings of good quality rums, which are far way exceeding their expectations and allaying and offsetting the disappointment when they spend even more money on a lacklustre single malt Scotch whisky, which frankly just isn't ticking the boxes. Things are moving fast here, and I want to interject with something right now. There's one region of whisky making which the Scotch Whisky Association hasn't taken issue with, and yet is potentially the biggest threat to Scotch whisky. And that is English whisky. English whisky is using English names. They are forging their own identity, separate, different from Scotch whisky, generally bottling at higher strengths, waiting till their product is mature before they bottle it, and not just chancing it in the goodwill of the customers. So one of the most exciting and rapidly growing regions in the world of quality whiskies now is England. So in fact, it would probably do you better if you're a Canadian distillery to give yourself an English name, and you'll probably be left alone in peace and quiet. I have had some information from Macaloni's distillery, and it caused me some concern. As far as I was concerned, and I contacted them about this when they asked my opinion, says, do you know what you should do? Change Caledonian to Canadonian. Change the spelling of Macaloni to another spelling which isn't Scottish, something like that. And absolutely capitalise 100% on all this priceless free marketing and advertising that the Scotch Whisky Association's heavy-handedness, quote unquote, is providing you. Don't spend too much money on lawyers. Ask the Scotch Whisky Association, right, give me a full list of non-Scottish names that we could potentially use. Put it out to your whisky club. Pick a new name. Make a feature of it. When you have your label and when you're packaging, put formerly Macaloni's. And you could even have special limited editions where you put a redacted Scotch Whisky Association letter into the box with every single bottle of whisky, because that would be collectible big time. There's ways around it. But I was then contacted, not that long ago now, Maltmates, to say that the German-based distributor for Macaloni's whisky in Europe had been approached by Scotch Whisky Association and threatened in some way unless they discontinued distributing Macaloni's Canadian whisky to countries within the European Union. And I have to say, I think that's quite a dangerous move by the Scotch Whisky Association, because I do think they're jumping the gun, and I do think that that decision, based in mind that Macaloni's are a Canadian distiller and have done nothing illegal under Canadian law, nothing at all. It really smacks of old British imperialistic gunboat diplomacy. Someone somewhere has made a decision a little bit prematurely, and people are really noticing this. If I was advising the Scotch Whisky Association at this moment in time, what I would advise is a little bit more tactfulness in resolving this situation. Because at the moment, all that's happening is the situation is, as it becomes more antagonistic, it's becoming far more visible online. The whisky world is very different from 12 years ago. So much more conversation is happening online, in forums, whisky clubs, at whisky festivals, within speciality whisky groups, peated whisky groups, American whisky groups. And people are asking the question, well, okay though, if the Scotch Whisky Association don't like Macaloni using a Scottish word for their Canadian distillery, what do they think of Glendalough in Ireland using Glen? What do they think of Macmura in Sweden using Mac? What do they think of McCarthy's Oregon distillery using McCarthy for an American single malt whisky? So again, there's not an easy response to this, because we're not hearing much from the Scotch Whisky Association about that. And therefore, by implication, it makes this whole situation look more like harassment, selective harassment. And the harassment bit comes in because Canada has 100% every right, culturally, historically, to use Scottish references, because the modern nation of Canada was built by a large number of Scottish settlers who were evicted, deported, bullied and thrown out of their own country, which didn't have space for them. And when they left, they took their cultural rights with them, and these rights still remain. I approached the Scotch Whisky Association for a response, and I've received one, so thank you to the Scotch Whisky Association for a prompt reply to my inquiry as regards the situation, so that I could give a balanced perspective. And a spokesman from the Scotch Whisky Association has said that EU law protects geographical indicators such as Scotch whisky to a very high level, including preventing the use of names which evoke association with the protected GI. This was recently highlighted by a decision of a German appeal court that the use of Glen as part of a brand name, Glen Buchenbach, on a German whisky evoked Scotch whisky, and therefore it was not permitted. That seems reasonable. However, Macaloni's distillery is not in Germany. It's in Canada and has every cultural right to use Scottish references in a country with a clearly defined Scottish culture. Now that Britain is no longer a part of the EU due to Brexit, how's this going to look when a complaint lands on the desk of the European Union Trade Commissioner's office and it's taken badly? Could this result in tariffs and distribution difficulties for Scotch whisky? I'm just asking a question, that's all. One thing's for sure, I certainly wouldn't have made that decision to try and prevent Macaloni's being distributed within Europe. Absolutely no way. That's a dangerous decision in my opinion. Don't get me wrong. Generally the Scotch Whisky Association does a good job. Scotch whisky industry, well, it needs to be protected because there are imitators out there. Big businesses, very profitable business elsewhere around the world that use Scottish cultural references, which could be causing confusion, like Bagpiper, for example, in India. McDowell's, another option. Indian whisky. But it's certainly the case that a distillery could crop up anywhere and pretend to be a Scotch whisky distillery and try and freeload on the reputation that Scotch whisky, well, used to have. But things are changing fast. I have, as a long-time commentator online, I have a fairly interesting overview of everything. And including this, I don't think this is going to end well for anybody, to be honest. I think, in my opinion, that the Scotch Whisky Association should just gently back away a little bit and try and reach more mutual consensus with Macaloni's if that is possible. And I also think that Macaloni's should be a bit more playful with this and not divert too much money from the business into legal fees, trying to fight it all the way with all the stress and anxiety. I mean, this is an opportunity to, for example, Caledonian becomes Canadonian. It's to actually kind of create fusion names that just makes it more difficult for the distillery to be singled out. Mind you, if it's singled out in terms of global awareness for a very good quality product with huge international interest and demand, well, good luck. All I would say to that is it just shows you that Canada is one of the great hidden whisky making countries in the world, and that if one small distillery in Victoria can do it, many others can follow in its footsteps with their Caledonian distillery, rightio, because if publicity means another lawyer's letter from the Scotch Whisky Association, business is business. But I tell you, ultimately what really pisses me off, and over and above this, is this assumed cultural appropriation by an industry of a culture that is in fact internationally shared, and legitimately so. Things have to be far more tactfully handled, because you talk to any Scots person and they will side with Canada, because Canada has Scottish blood flowing in its cultural bloodstream, and that can never be removed. Scotch Whisky Association, don't even try to remove it, because you'll make a lot more people a lot more angry a lot more quickly. And that, malt mates, is really all I have to say in the matter for the moment. I wish and hope that there will be a satisfactory resolution, so that both the Scotch Whisky Association and Macaloney's Distillery can both get something constructive out of this and move on. Bye-bye.